Citizen journalism, it's an interesting term when you think about it, because if you're an undocumented immigrant with a video camera capturing the world going on, you're technically not a citizen, but you're still engaged in so-called citizen journalism. And if you're a reporter for CNN, Fox, etc., you're also still a citizen. And I'd like to think that our journalists are working on behalf of the public, whether or not they get a check from a major corporation. So this term citizen journalism, to me, draws a lot of problems, a lot of alarms go off. The term volunteer journalist, to me, rings much more true than citizen journalist. But you asked, where do I see the role of these volunteer journalists, if you will? And first and foremost, they're the watchdog of the watchdog. Because the press is supposed to be the watchdog of government, business, and get to the dirt of what's really going on behind closed doors. And for the most part, they do a fairly decent job of that. Obviously, they slip up here and there. And there's lots of things that don't get covered for who knows what reason. But who's going to hold the press in check when the press, when the corporate media doesn't cover something because it's not in the best interest of their business, of their shareholders, not in the best interest of advertising, or when they simply make a mistake? Who's going to bring that attention to the public? Because certainly they're not going to. They're not going to say, by the way, we didn't run a story about smoking because Philip Morris is our #1 sponsor. That's just never going to happen. So someone has to go report on that, and that's one of the roles of volunteer journalists. Another role is that there's simply not enough professional journalists to cover everything that needs to be done. And we need to get away from this idea of journalists as the gatekeepers. We aren't gatekeepers, we're public servants. And as public servants, our commitment is to informing the world about what's going on. And that's the exact same role of volunteer journalists. They just have different beats, different drives fueling their journalism. But their end result, their end goal is exactly the same. And I don't think it's fair to look at them any differently, really, than anyone else. Now, in terms of the approach that so-called citizen journalists or volunteer journalists take to covering the media or covering the world, there's sort of a new language being born. We've moved much more towards transparency than objectivity. And if you ask me, objectivity is a farce. I was reporting on a story. Well, actually, most of the stories I report on at my day job is in a local newspaper, I feel pretty objective about. But every once in a while there's a story that I really do care about. And when I write down my story at the end of the day, even if I care about it, I pretend that I have no opinion. And that's insane. If you're a Jewish journalist working for the New York Times covering the Israeli-Palestine conflict, you're going to have an opinion on the matter, even though your reporting is going to pretend you don't. And that's going to shape your reporting, whether or not you want to admit it. So I think we're a lot better off in holding true to transparency and saying, these are my views, but this is how I saw the situation. That way you can discount their views and actually be an informed reader. As it stands right now, it's a crapshoot as to whether or not it's accurate or if their own prejudices shape their reporting. How can you trust citizen journalists? They don't have the authority to be accurate. You know, who knows? You don't know where they're coming from. But that falls down not on the citizen journalists of being irresponsible. That's almost like blaming the victim. The reality is that the reader or the watcher, if we're talking video, should be informed, should view everything with a critical eye. Because every single word that someone says is coming from a particular perspective that's fueled with motivations. And until we get to the point where every time the everyday Joe or Jane turns on the TV and says, well, why are they saying that? Then we're at a disadvantage in terms of what's really going on. Like, people talk about how we need objective news because that way people can trust it. We need the New York Times because people trust the New York Times and they might not trust some blogger. Well, you shouldn't trust the New York Times because they have a several hundred-year record of being a reliable source, because we know the New York Times has made some major slips throughout the years, and they're going to continue to make those kind of slips, and some of them are intentional, others are just mistakes. but it's the role of the audience to think critically, and we really need to focus on media literacy and raise the consciousness to the point where people ask, why did someone say this? Not just assume that it's the gospel because the New York Times said it.